So let's walk through a basic failover clustering configuration. Now this is going to be a very basic failover clustering configuration. So we're not going to go real deep into it. I've only got a single server to work with. So we're going to keep this pretty straightforward, and we're going to show you how to install and set up a basic clustering configuration. In another video, we'll go over how to create a cluster role. Now let's start by making this full screen, shall we? I'll make it a little easier to read. There we go. So let's go to Manage and Add Roles and Features. Now, just like network load balancing, failover clustering is a feature, not a role. So we're going to find failover clustering and add features. Now, unlike network load balancing, failover clustering is designed to provide, well, failover redundancy. So you'll typically have an active system and a standby system. And if your active system fails, then your standby system becomes the active system. It works better than network load balancing for content that is dynamic. So things that are constantly changing typically will work better using failover clustering than they will using network load balancing. Okay. Um, because we only have a single server to work with, we're going to do a single server configuration, and then maybe in another video we'll when we've got a few more resources we'll tackle some more advanced configurations. But we'll at least get through the basic how to install and configure a basic cluster. So now that we've got our clustering installed, we'll go to Tools and Failover Cluster Manager. Now, typically what you're going to want to do, didn't want to close that all the way out. All right. Typically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to validate your configuration. So we can right click and validate configuration here, create a cluster, connect to a cluster. We have the same options under management here and in our actions over here. So let's start with a validate configuration. So we're going to click next and we're going to add the devices we want to validate. So again, I'm single server, so I'm just going to do a loop back here. And we're going to validate this server. Now, if you had multiple servers, what you would want to do is add in all of the servers here that you're going to put in this cluster and validate their configuration together. So I'm going to click Next. And we're going to run all tests. We can run specific tests, and you'd sometimes do that if you had ran all tests before, and then there were only specific ones you wanted to double check after you'd fixed some issues. I like to run all tests anyway. That way, just in case I've created another issue, go ahead and click Next to get it going, we'll still be able to find it. So, it runs through all of our tests. There we go. And now we can view the report. So this is going to open up inside a web browser. And yes, allow blocked content, or blocked content, we'll do it on our own system. So here we go. We have inventory was a success. We had a warning on our network, and we had a warning on our system configuration. Now warnings will not stop the system from running or from creating the cluster. It will just tell you there's a potential problem with it. So I go to my validate my IP. So I clicked on my network and I'm going to go to validate my IP configuration, and warnings are going to be highlighted here in yellow. So I don't have a default gateway. Well, that's okay. I'm on an isolated system. DNS suffix search list. So what you'll do is you'll go through and you'll check these and see, are these things that I need to be aware of or things that are going to create problems for me? If it does, then you probably want to get that fixed. Now in this case, it passed, so I'm going to go ahead and create the cluster now using the validated nodes and click Finish. So that starts my failover cluster configuration. So I'm going to set a cluster name for it, and I'm going to call this cluster 2. See if I can spell it right. and dot last name dot local. Now I've got one network defined. If I had multiple networks that I had IP addresses on, I could add additional networks or choose which one I wanted for my cluster configuration. And then I'm going to give it a different address. So I'm going to say we're going to use 10.1.1.7. Now my IP address is 10.1.1.10. So you're going to, just like you did with network load balancing clustering, you're going to pick another address on your network that's not currently being used that all of the devices in the cluster are going to share. So in this case, I'm using 10.1.1.7. I'm going to click Next. And then here's our confirmation. Click Next, and away it goes, creating a cluster. Now, once you get your cluster created, it actually won't do anything. So with network load balancing clustering, we set the ports that we wanted it to manage. With this, once we get it up, we'll have the cluster created, but the cluster doesn't do anything until we add a cluster role. We're going to do that in another video, but I want to show you some quick things here with the cluster. Now you'll notice here we have clusters failed. That's because it only has one node. So this one node is currently the IP address. It says it's online. Here we can configure a role, validate the cluster again to make sure it's working, add another role, copy cluster roles, do cluster aware updating. We can expand and we can look at our roles that are available under our cluster, the nodes that are available in our cluster, any storage that's available in our cluster, including cluster shared storage, which we don't have any of at the moment, the networks that are in use on our cluster, and then any events related to our cluster. And at this point, it's going to kind of go crazy because right here, cluster group has exceeded its failover threshold, which means I don't have anything that I've actually clustered it with, and so that's creating that issue. So that wasn't the point. The point was to walk you through and let you see how this actually can and should work. So we have, and I just realized I double typed my name here. When we did the name, I did cluster2.dalton.local. I only had to do cluster2 because it already appends the .dalton.local, which is my current domain name. Okay, so that one little thing aside, hopefully we can see now how we can go about creating a failover cluster. Now, frequently, what you'll want to do after you've created it, you might want to go ahead and run through a validation, just see if there are any other warnings now that you've got the cluster created that you need to deal with. And then you'd start adding nodes, unless you did so with multiple devices when you started. But you're definitely going to have to start adding cluster roles and configuring cluster storage. So those would be the next steps, but we'll tackle that a little bit later on.